In 1912, a bride named Alice Smith was found mysteriously still in her bathtub. There were no signs of foul play, just an unfortunate newlywed in an incident doctors called an accident. But then it happened again, and again, 3 different women in 3 different towns, with one unsettling connection. A charming man who had just swept them off their feet. This is the true story of George Joseph Smith and the events that shocked Edwardian Britain. Please note, this video explores historical crimes and is intended for educational and documentary purposes. It contains non-graphic discussion of tragic real-life events that are already publicly available. Viewer discretion is advised. George Joseph Smith was born in London's Cockney East End, in Bethnal Green, in 1872, right in the heart of the Victorian era. His father worked as a respectable insurance agent, and despite the hardships many faced at the time, Smith didn't have a bad start in life. His parents worked hard to create a comfortable lifestyle and good opportunities for their son, but it seems that even from a young age, Smith was a bit of a bad apple. He just couldn't help but cause trouble, and had no qualms in lying, stealing, and manipulating to get what he wanted. By the age of just 9, his parents were at their wits' end, and George was sent to live in a reformatory, which is basically a Victorian boarding school designed to rehabilitate young offenders and destitute children deemed beyond parental control. Life in a Victorian reformatory wouldn't have been easy. He would have been expected to follow a strict routine full of chores, hard work, and manual labour. There were harsh rules, and discipline was severe for any rule breakers. These reformatories aimed to teach young people a trade and turn them into useful members of society. But this didn't sit well with George, and his rebellious nature meant he ended up staying there until he was 16 years old. Unfortunately, George didn't seem to learn much from his time in the reformatory. Instead of embracing the hard work and good values being taught to him, he simply learnt how to manipulate and lie even more than before, coming out worse than when he went in. After he got out, he changed his name and started using the alias George Oliver Love. He moved to Leicester and opened a bakery. It was shortly after this he met his first and only legitimate wife, Caroline Beatrice Thornhill. She was just 18 when they met, and George turned on the charm. He was described as being a very charming man when he wanted to be, and no doubt Caroline would have seen him as a good catch. He had a successful business and spoke of having big dreams. It would have likely been an exciting life, if only it had been true. They married in 1898, but shortly after, Caroline found out that the bakery wasn't quite as successful as George had made out. It was actually doing really badly and went bankrupt. This meant her having to take on the role as breadwinner, and she started working as a maid so that they could get by. But this wasn't enough for George. He wanted more, and he had no intention of working hard to get the life he wanted. That's when he convinced his wife Caroline to start stealing from her employers and workplace. They even moved around to stop them from getting caught. But eventually they were caught when a pawnbroker got suspicious of some jewellery that Caroline was attempting to sell. She was arrested and sentenced to 12 months in prison. George, on the other hand, simply disappeared and carried on with his life, letting her take the fall. It seems the time away from George was actually good for her, and as bad as her story is, you could say that she's one of the lucky ones. As while she was inside, she had plenty of time to think about the situation she had gotten herself into. She began to realise that the man she married wasn't actually a very nice person, and that he had led her astray. It's not the life she wanted or what she signed up for. When she got out, she wanted nothing more to do with him. But by a weird coincidence, she happened to spot George out and about, and she immediately called the police. He was finally taken into custody for his part in their crimes, and in 1901 he was given 2 years in prison. Caroline then left the UK and started a new life in Canada. She never spoke to George again, but the two never officially divorced. When George got out of prison, he went right back to his pattern of deception, and this time he had his ambitions set even higher. And he thought he'd found his ideal target. He'd prey upon unmarried women, which sadly there was no shortage of in Edwardian England. It was very normal at the time for nearly all women to want to find a husband. It raised their status, improved their quality of life, gave them stability, and was seen as the respectable thing to do. The pressure on women to get married in Edwardian Britain was high, and it was a competitive market amongst the women to find themselves a good, decent man to marry. This unfortunately led to some women accepting marriages with men that were less than desirable, especially as they started to get older or struggled to find a match. George knew exactly how to use this to his advantage, and between the years of 1908 and 1915, he went on to have 7 bigamous marriages with unsuspecting women, changing his name and moving around multiple times to continue his awful lifestyle. In June 1908, he married June Wilson, a widow from Worthing. But by the 3rd of July, he had sold all her possessions and emptied £30 from her bank account, which would be worth around £4,000 today. Then he left her to deal with the heartbreak and the hardship, moving to Bristol and opening an antique store. He quickly moved on to remarry Edith Pegler that same year. They met after George put a job advert out for a housekeeper, and Edith replied. It's said that Edith may have been his favourite wife, as he seemed genuinely attached to her and returned to her on multiple occasions. He even married her under his real name. Or maybe he just found her convenient. Whatever it was he saw in Edith, it didn't stop him from abandoning her regularly and disappearing for long periods. He would just tell her he was going to look for stuff to sell in their antique store, and off he'd go, not to be seen again for months at a time. Much like an Edwardian Tinder Swindler, this is when George would go searching for his next victims, often heading towards Britain's seaside towns where he could turn on the charm to any single women he came across, making himself almost irresistible by always dressing smartly and behaving like a perfect gentleman, impressing the ladies and showering them with attention and affection. In October 1909, just the following year after marrying Edith, he married Sarah Freeman under the name George Rose Smith. He quickly proceeded to sell her war bonds and empty her savings, pocketing £400, around £40,000 in today's money, before fleeing and leaving her with nothing. He repeated this process over and over with different wives, either stealing all their savings or conning them into giving him money for fake business ventures or other lies. Then he'd leave, usually heading back to Edith like nothing ever happened, always returning with large amounts of money, then before long, leaving to do it all over again. In 1910, he met Bessie Mundy whilst walking in Bristol. He quickly discovered that not only was she the daughter of a wealthy bank manager, but she'd also just inherited £2,500, a huge amount of money back then, and he wanted to get every penny of it for himself. He used the name Henry Williams and said he worked restoring paintings in London. He'd soon manipulated his way into her life, marrying Bessie and going after her money as fast as he could. But he ran into an unexpected problem. He couldn't access Bessie's money, as it was being kept safely in a trust for her. This would have infuriated him and put a stop to his plan, but he still managed to convince Bessie to hand over £150 in cash before swiftly abandoning her and running back to Edith. He then sent Bessie a letter implying that she had given him an illness and said he was going to get treatment, but she never heard anything else from him after that. It was only by another unfortunate coincidence that Bessie bumped into him again on a beach in Weston-super-Mare just 18 months later. She was walking along the seafront when she noticed her husband standing just feet away, looking out towards the waves. It took him a moment to even notice her as she approached him calling out Henry, the fake name he'd used when he married her. George was taken by surprise but wasn't about to let this opportunity slip past him again. He still had his eyes on her money and immediately began to apologize to Bessie. He started creating a story to explain why he'd left, claiming he'd been searching for her everywhere and that he was desperately trying to find her and return to her all these months. We don't know if Bessie believed his story, or if really at the time, just the thought of being alone seemed worse than being with a lying husband. Whatever the reason, she accepted his apology and took him back. In 1912, George and Bessie moved to Herne Bay in Kent. But he was quickly faced with the same obstacle. He still couldn't access Bessie's money. This is when his actions took a much darker turn. First, he convinced Bessie to create a will, leaving everything to him. Then, he began planting the idea that she was suffering from sudden fits, even going so far as to bring in a doctor who came to believe his story. He then said he was going to make some home improvements and went to an ironmonger and purchased a heavy cast iron bath for £1, 17 shillings and sixpence. Shortly after, Bessie was found in the tub, unresponsive, still clutching onto a bar of soap in her hand. The incident was officially ruled a case of misadventure, and George quietly collected Bessie's £2,500 inheritance. He spent as little as possible on her funeral, not even bothering to buy her a private plot. And if that weren't brazen enough, he even returned the bath to the ironmonger for a full refund, before disappearing once again like nothing had happened. Less than a year later, he met another woman in Southsea, a nurse named Alice Burnham, whom he married on November 4th, 1913. She wasn't wealthy like Bessie, but this didn't deter him, and he convinced Alice to take out a £500 insurance policy with him as the sole beneficiary. He then took Alice on a honeymoon to Blackpool, making sure to book accommodation with a bathtub, something that was a rare luxury at the time. Then almost immediately after arriving, once again, George encouraged his wife to see a doctor, claiming she had constant headaches. Then on the night of December 12th, just days after they had arrived in Blackpool, Alice went to take a bath whilst George went downstairs to the kitchen to speak to the landlady. As they were talking, they began to notice water starting to drip through the ceiling and were shocked to discover Alice upstairs, just how he'd previously found Bessie. Once again, nothing appeared suspicious, and George collected the insurance and spent as minimal amount he could on Alice's funeral, before swiftly taking on the new name of Charles Oliver James and marrying yet again in September 1914 to another woman named Alice Reevell. He told her he was an artist and that he owned land in Canada. Alice didn't have much money, and George had little reason to hang around. He took Alice for a day out. They went on a tram ride through an idyllic public garden, but at some point in the day he told Alice that he had some urgent business that he needed to attend to. He told her that he would return in about an hour and asked her to wait right here until he came back. But obviously he never did. I can't imagine what was going through her mind while she waited. In a time before mobile phones and instant communication, she was just left completely in the dark. She had no idea that the moment they parted ways, George went straight home, emptied her savings of £90 and sold all her belongings. He even gifted some of her clothes to Edith when he returned to her in Bristol. Just a couple of months after, on the 17th of December, George entered into his 7th and final marriage using the name John Lloyd, with a 38-year-old woman called Margaret Lofty. In a twist of irony, they met in the Roman spa town of Bath, which may have been no accident on George's part, with him being drawn to places associated with water. Margaret hadn't had the best luck when it came to love. When they met, she was still getting over a recent breakup where she'd found out the person she was with was already secretly married. Margaret Lofty's father was a clergyman and she wasn't particularly wealthy, but she had been sensible and put some savings by. But by this point, George was growing impatient and ever more greedy. He no longer cared what the women he married had or didn't have. He knew exactly what he was going to do. He moved them into a lodging house in Highgate, London, ensuring that the property already had a bathroom. Shortly after, he got Margaret to take out an insurance policy worth £700 to be made payable to him if anything were to happen to her. Then, like clockwork, he took her to see a doctor, again claiming that she was suffering with constant headaches. Despite George's sketchy behaviour, that same day Margaret wrote a letter to her mother about what a wonderful husband she had, saying that he was the best husband in the world and that he was a good, kind Christian man. Confirming just how good an actor George was and how easily he could fool the people around him with his fake personas. But it seems that George wasn't able to keep up the nice guy act for very long, and just the very next day after he and Margaret got married, he had already become distant to his new bride. The day after their wedding, at around 8 p.m, the landlady was ironing in the kitchen when she heard noises coming from upstairs. She could hear subtle sounds and splashing coming from the bathroom, but she didn't hear anything that sounded too concerning, more like the usual sounds that you'd almost expect to hear if someone was having a bath. Seconds later, George came downstairs and sat at the piano in the living room. Eerily, he played the hymn, "Nearer My God to Thee," the song reportedly played by the musicians during the sinking of the Titanic, which happened just a couple of years prior. Once he'd finished, he stood up and asked the landlady if she'd seen his wife. She said no, so George went to look upstairs. Moments later, he discovered Margaret, and he immediately started playing the part of the grieving husband. He thought he could do what he always did, and started organising a minimal funeral service and went about collecting his insurance money. Unlike the earlier incidents, which had only been mentioned in local newspapers, this occurred in London, and what happened to Margaret made headlines across the country. A newlywed bride found in such unusual circumstances just one day after her wedding was impossible for the press to ignore, and the publicity didn't go unnoticed. It just so happens that Alice Burnham's father, Mr. Charles Burnham, came across the news story, and he was shocked to read how similar the details were to his own daughter's passing just a couple of years before. He reached out to Mr. Joseph Crossley, who owned the boarding house in Blackpool where the couple had honeymooned, and together they wrote a letter expressing their concerns to Detective Inspector Arthur Neal at the Metropolitan Police. They included 2 newspaper clippings, the recent one from 1914 regarding Margaret Lofty, and another from 1913 about Alice Burnham. Although the husbands' names were different in the stories, the circumstances were so similar that they urged the police to investigate. Detective Inspector Arthur Neal started looking into the case, and it didn't take him long to discover all the insurance policies and wills that had interestingly been signed just days before the marriages took place. He also visited the properties and inspected the baths, trying to figure out how anyone could drown in such a narrow space with only a small amount of water. He also interviewed the coroner, Dr. Bates, and asked him to delay sending his medical report to the insurance company to buy more time. After some more investigating, they also discovered the case of Bessie Mundy in Herne Bay, and they were pretty confident that it was the same man who was married to all 3 women using different names. Neal asked Dr. Bates to write a favourable report to allow George to access the insurance money, confident that he would be there to meet him and bring him into custody. On the 1st of February, George Joseph Smith went to collect his payment. He was immediately approached by Detective Neal, who asked if he was John Lloyd. Expecting to receive his money, George replied, "Yes," but was surprised when Neal followed up with, "And are you also George Smith?" which he vehemently denied. Neal then informed him that he was being taken in for questioning on suspicion of bigamy, and upon hearing that lesser crime, George admitted that it was also his name. George Joseph Smith was formally charged with the murders of Bessie Mundy, Alex Burnham and Margaret Lofty on the 23rd of March, 1915. On the 22nd of June, George's trial started at the Old Bailey. He denied the charges and behaved badly in the courtroom, shouting at those giving evidence and calling them names. The courtroom was packed out, mainly with women who'd waited hours to get a glimpse of the man they'd read about. I guess they were curious as to what kind of person could have had so many people fooled, expecting to see a monster, but like many others, they would have been surprised by how regular and normal he looked, showing you really can't judge a book by its cover. George declined to give evidence at his trial, which he wrote on this note. During the trial, the prosecution had to prove how George had carried out his crimes, as there was no evidence of injury on any of the women. Detective Neal had hired similarly built female divers to demonstrate what they believed had taken place, and everyone was taken back by what they saw. It was demonstrated that George would have likely lifted their feet quickly out of the water. This immediately submerged their upper half, and the rush of water led to shock and unconsciousness. The diver demonstrating even had to be pulled out and revived by doctors, confirming this is a reasonable explanation. On July 1st, it took the jury just 20 minutes to find Smith guilty, and he was sentenced to death. On Friday the 13th, August 1915, George Joseph Smith was executed at Maidstone Prison. It was said that Edith, the only wife he kept going back to, wept as she heard the news. But for George's first and only legitimate wife, Caroline Thornhill, she was relieved to finally be free to marry the Canadian man she'd fallen in love with. Thank you for watching, and if you've listened to this point, we would really appreciate it if you'd like and subscribe. It really makes a difference to our small channel, and we're thankful for every single one of you watching. Until next time, goodbye.